It had been going on for almost an hour. November 14th, 2025, just after midnight local time. On the surface, the Novorossiysk Gulf looked normal. Dark water, quiet shoreline, a handful of bored soldiers staring out across the bay. But in the next few minutes, that calm would collide with something the Russians believed could never reach this place. Long-range Neptune missiles, carrying hundreds of kilograms of high explosive, aimed straight at the most protected port in the entire Russian rear. Because Novorossiysk wasn't just a port. It was Russia's largest seaport, bigger than St. Petersburg, bigger than Murmansk, an economic artery and a military hub wrapped in layers of air defense. Panzer and Tor systems at the edges. S-300 and S-400 batteries deeper inside. And around the city, a posture that looked like an invisible dome. Multiple S-400 launchers positioned to make the map feel untouchable. For Russian generals, Novorossiysk was a thick red box, protected, defended, safe. That night, the box got opened. Here's the uncomfortable truth Russia learned the hard way. S-400 is terrifying until a sea-skimming cruise missile forces it to fight physics, and physics doesn't negotiate. Hundreds of kilometers away in southern Ukraine, a camouflaged launch truck sat perfectly still among pine trees. Odessa region, roughly 600 kilometers from the port. Inside the cab, a non-commissioned officer stared at a panel with a red safety cover. He paused, just long enough to understand what he was about to do. Then he flipped it up. Behind the truck, 4 long canisters rose upright, tall vertical tubes pointing into the night like silent pillars. Inside each tube was one of the Kremlin's most feared surprises at this stage of the war, the long-range land attack version of the Neptune cruise missile. Not a short hop, not a coastal poke, a weapon built to reach deep. Next to the vehicle, an engineer checked the final line on his laptop. Wind, temperature, planned route, intermediate navigation points, a sea-skimming profile over the Black Sea. And then the target package flashed in the corner. Clean, simple, brutal. 2 missiles tasked to strike the S-400 cluster of the Kuban regiment on the hills east of Novorossiysk. 2 missiles tasked to hit the Sheskharis terminal, pump stations and tank farm, fuel and infrastructure. If the first pair succeeded, Russia would lose the shield. If the second pair succeeded, Novorossiysk would bleed. The silence around the truck wasn't just caution, it was understanding. If this worked, Long Neptune wouldn't just destroy equipment. It would bury the myth that Novorossiysk couldn't be touched, the myth that S-400 meant safety. The commander gave one short instruction. The countdown rolled. 10, 5, 3. The night cracked open. A deep rumble hit first. Then the lid of the first canister blew and a dark shape punched upward. The booster ignited. Vertical climb, sparks, smoke. And then, seconds later, the missile tipped its nose toward the Black Sea and dropped. Second missile, third, fourth. A sequence of launches so fast, it felt like a single breath. Out over open water, the Neptunes settled into their hunting profile. Subsonic, around 900 kilometers per hour, only meters above the sea surface. To a distant observer, it would look like nothing. But far away, in the hills beyond Novorossiysk, an air defense regiment was about to watch its screens turn into a nightmare. Inside the command shelter of the Kuban anti-aircraft regiment, the duty operator's radar display went from routine to red in seconds. Civilian traffic, slow tracks, quiet lanes. Then, without warning, dozens of returns. Then hundreds. Small dots multiplying across the scope, arriving at different altitudes, from different directions, flowing toward the city like a flood. The alarm blared. Operators shouted the first assumption every system is trained to make. Drones. Swarm. Mass attack. And that first assumption triggered the first fatal decision. Because while the radar picture looked like a swarm, not all swarms are equal. Ukraine wasn't just sending targets, Ukraine was sending confusion. FPV and FP drones diving directly into the S-400 radar lobes, forcing the system to classify, track, and prioritize dozens of weak echoes. Cruise missile or quadcopter, jammer or decoy, real threat, or noise. The screen became a mess, and the Russian crews did what their training demanded: shoot the densest cluster, fire at the most visible, engage what looks biggest. That reflex felt correct. It was wrong, because the densest cluster was bait. And while attention climbed upward into higher altitude tracks and loud targets, 4 real missiles were doing exactly what a sea skimmer was designed to do: ride the horizon, stay low enough to hide, arrive late enough that the defense would already be distracted. Here's the trick Ukraine was exploiting. S-400 has a huge theoretical range, but radar cannot see through the curve of the Earth. A missile flying just a few meters above sea level stays below the radar horizon until the final moments. No matter how advanced the system is, it still has to obey geometry. Ukraine turned that geometry into a weapon. The Neptunes had launched, climbed to lock their route with INS and satellite navigation, then dropped hard toward the sea. Lower profile, smaller radar cross-section, a corridor of invisibility, and behind them, the drone pressure kept building, small targets popping in and out, hopping altitude, forcing algorithms to chase ghosts. Panzer batteries opened fire first. Then S-300 and S-400 units started launching expensive interceptors into the dark. White streaks, bright mid-air detonations, a fireworks show above the bay, and on the port's cameras, you can hear the tone almost mocking, people describing the spectacle like it's an air show. Because from the docks, that's what it looked like. From the defense screens, it was the system consuming itself. While Russian crews counted kills, the real threat slid under their field of focus. At the bottom edge of the radar envelope, inside the dead band, 4 Long Neptunes kept coming. As the first 2 crossed the coastline, they rose slightly, just enough to pull the hills into their seeker view. Their imaging guidance woke up. The thermal scene sharpened. Hotspots appeared in the cold night like glowing targets in a shooting gallery. A spinning early warning radar, a rectangular engagement radar, launchers parked side by side, tubes upright, generators humming, everything warm against the winter air. Inside the missile, the template match snapped together. Radar, launcher, control node, one package, one kill. The first Neptune made a subtle nose correction, then stayed low, then rose at the last instant, just enough, and plunged into the center of the cluster. For a fraction of a second, there was silence. Then the hill exploded. A violent fireball split the sky above Novorossiysk, and in the first instant of that blast, the radar head itself was thrown. Metal, fragments, sparks, scattering into surrounding equipment. Milliseconds later, the nightmare got worse. Because missiles stored in the launchers began cooking off, secondary detonations, one after another, turning a precision air defense position into uncontrolled fireworks. Multiple columns of flame, separate points of ignition, a chain reaction nobody can counter. Seconds later, the second Neptune arrived on the other cluster, near the engagement radar. A near-identical pattern: impact, generator failure, detonations, stored warheads lighting off like a sequence of flares. And now, the truth was unavoidable. The regiment's shield was gone. Not every launcher needed to be destroyed. If the radars were wiped, the rest became blind shells. By early morning, satellite imagery and leaked assessments would clarify the damage. Multiple launchers destroyed, key radar systems wiped out, remaining tubes still on the field, but without eyes, without guidance, without a functional engagement picture. The Kuban regiment hadn't just taken a hit, it had been neutralized. And that mattered for one reason. Those first 2 Neptunes didn't exist only to destroy hardware. They existed to open the gate. Because while the hills burned, the 3rd and 4th Neptunes were already inbound, still riding the sea surface, heading for Sheskharis. And now, with the shield fractured and short-range systems still chasing drones, the missiles had a cleaner run. The 3rd Neptune seeker shifted away from the hills and toward the coast. The oil terminal glowed in the thermal view. Huge circular hotspots from tanks, dense rectangular signatures from buildings and pump stations. The missile chose the pumping station. In the final seconds, it rose slightly, then dove steeply. Impact. A flash of white light at the heart of the terminal. The warhead detonated over the manifold, shattering pumps, control rooms, and power distribution in a single blow. And then the fire began moving through the pipelines, like flame traveling through veins. The fourth Neptune followed seconds behind. Its job was the tank farm. It selected a full tank, heat, shape, mass, a clean lock, a dive, an explosion, and then the kind of fireball that turns night into day. On the port footage, you can hear voices reacting, astonished, almost admiring, calling it beautiful. Not because it was harmless, because it was unreal. 4 missiles from far away, 2 to blind the shield, 2 to hit the infrastructure, 1 synchronized sequence that turned an untouchable port into a crisis zone. And the strike didn't end with the 4 missiles. Once the defenses were rattled, another wave of drones pressed in from different vectors. Some verified damage around the pump area, some searched for intact facilities, others moved toward container yards and internal infrastructure. Explosions began multiplying across the bay. A UAV struck an energy control building. Parts of the terminal entered emergency shutdown, except the core systems that should have coordinated shutdown procedures had already been hit, so the response failed unevenly. In the tank yard, secondary fires deepened. In the container area, more blasts appeared. At least 1 civilian ship was damaged, whether by debris or shockwave, and reports emerged of crew injuries. This wasn't just a military strike anymore. It was a rear area event, a domestic shock. Russia's Ministry of Defense responded with the reflex statement, dozens of Ukrainian UAVs shot down, and maybe that was true, but it didn't change the only fact that mattered. The main package got through. The shield was blinded, the terminal was burning, and Novorossiysk, once treated as safe, had just been forced into emergency status. Independent sources and local reporting described a state of emergency and closures around the port area. The untouchable box on the map had become a live fire scene, and that is the lesson of Novorossiysk. Modern air defense isn't only about range or money, it's about attention. It's about geometry. It's about what happens when your system is busy swatting decoys, while the real threat arrives at the lowest edge of the horizon, where physics hides it until it's too late. Because on November 14, 2025, Ukraine didn't just hit a port. Ukraine showed that even the most expensive dome can be cracked if you force it to look the wrong way first.